Tonight, we find ourselves walking through a snowy Alpine village on a cold December evening. The streets are quiet. Smoke rises from chimneys, and families huddle close to their fires. It's almost Christmas, a time we associate with warmth and joy and twinkling lights. But in this place, in this time, Christmas means something different. As we get started, I invite you to find a comfortable spot. If you enjoy falling asleep to these kinds of stories, I'd really appreciate a like or subscribe. I'm also curious as to where you're all listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is there. And now, with that being said, let's begin. As darkness falls, you hear it, a sound that makes your blood run cold. Bells, heavy, clanging cowbells getting closer. Then comes the rattling of chains, the stomp of boots, and suddenly the street fills with figures covered in fur and horns, their faces hidden behind carved wooden masks with long tongues and wild eyes. Children who've been naughty all year scatter and hide, while parents watch with knowing smiles. This isn't a scene from a horror movie. This is Christmas, the real Christmas, the old Christmas. The Christmas that existed long before shopping malls and greeting cards softened its edges. Take a slow breath and let your shoulders drop. We're going back in time tonight, back to when winter was darker and longer, when Christmas wasn't just about giving, but about reckoning, about the things that came down from the mountains when snow covered the ground, about the old spirits that never really left, even when new religions arrived. This is the story of the anti-Santas, the dark companions, the winter demons that haunted the longest nights of the year. And trust me, this isn't the Christmas story you learned in school. In the mountain villages of Austria and Bavaria, where winter comes hard and stays long, these aren't gentle rolling hills. These are serious mountains, places where winter could trap entire communities for months, where avalanches could bury villages, where the darkness of December seemed to swallow the world whole. In these isolated valleys, separated by impassable peaks, and connected only by narrow paths that disappeared under snow, people developed their own traditions, their own stories, their own ways of making sense of the long, dark nights. And one of those traditions involved a creature called Krampus. Now, you might have heard the name before, maybe seen him in movies or on quirky Christmas cards, but the real Krampus, the one that existed in these mountain communities for centuries, was something far more complex and far more deeply rooted than the cartoon demon we sometimes see today. The name Krampus likely comes from the old High German word Krampen, meaning claw, and claws are definitely part of his appearance. Picture this, a figure standing upright like a man, but covered entirely in dark fur, sometimes black, sometimes brown, matted and wild. His face, if you can call it that, is bestial, often described as goat-like, with long curved horns rising from his skull. His tongue lolls out, impossibly long and red. His eyes can be described as hollow or gleaming, depending on the telling. And yes, he has those claws, long, sharp, capable of grabbing. His feet might be hooves, or they might be human feet twisted into something not quite right. He wears chains wrapped around his body, and these chains drag behind him or hang from his frame, creating a constant metallic rattling that announces his approach. On his back, he carries a basket or a sack, large and worn, made of woven wood or rough fabric. But here's what makes Krampus so fascinating from a folklore perspective. He doesn't exist alone. He's not a standalone monster. Krampus is explicitly paired with St. Nicholas. That's right, Santa Claus himself, or at least the earlier European version of him. In the Alpine tradition, Saint Nicholas, dressed in bishop's robes with his tall mitre and carrying his golden staff, walks through villages on the night of December 5th, which is St. Nicholas Eve. He carries his book, the one that lists which children have been good and which have been bad. He brings gifts, sweets, nuts, small toys for the good children. But walking alongside him, or sometimes slightly behind him, comes Krampus, the shadow to Nicholas's light, the punishment to his reward. This partnership is crucial to understanding what Krampus really represents. He's not evil for evil's sake. He's not a demon trying to corrupt or destroy. He's part of a system, a balance. Nicholas represents the rewards of good behavior, the light of Christian virtue, the promise of heaven. Krampus represents consequences, the darkness that follows wrongdoing, the very real fears that medieval and early modern people had about falling outside the protection of community and faith. On Krampusnacht, the night of December 5th, this pair would visit homes throughout Alpine villages. St. Nicholas would knock on doors, and families would gather, children scrubbed clean, and on their best behavior, Nicholas would consult his book, asking parents about each child's conduct through the year. Good children received treats, praise and blessings, but naughty children, well, that's when Krampus stepped forward. He might rattle his chains at them, making them jump. He might growl or make strange animalistic sounds. In some traditions, he carried switches, bundles of birch branches, and would make a show of threatening to use them. The worst children, according to the stories, might be grabbed and stuffed into his basket, carried away into the night, presumably to his mountain lair, though the tales rarely specify exactly what happened after that. The threat itself was enough. Now, before we go further, let's be clear about something important. These weren't random scary stories told to traumatize children. This was a carefully maintained social tradition that served specific purposes in tight-knit mountain communities. First, it reinforced behavioral standards during the hardest time of year. Winter in the Alps was desperately difficult. Food was scarce, living spaces were cramped, tempers ran short. Children needed to obey quickly when told to stay away from dangerous frozen rivers or not to waste precious heating fuel. The threat of Krampus made those warnings stick. Second, it created a shared cultural experience. Everyone in the village knew these traditions. Everyone had grown up with them. The rituals brought communities together in the darkest season. And third, it provided a release valve. More on that in a moment. But where did Krampus come from? Why does this tradition exist at all? To answer that, we need to go back further, much further. Before Christianity reached these Alpine valleys, before St. Nicholas was even born, the people living in these mountains had their own beliefs, their own gods, their own ways of understanding winter. Pre-Christian Germanic and Alpine peoples celebrated the winter solstice, the darkest day of the year, as a crucial turning point. They called it Yule in some regions, and it marked the moment when the sun began its return, when days would slowly start to lengthen again. But the period leading up to the solstice and the days immediately after were considered especially dangerous. The boundary between the living world and the spirit world grew thin. The dead could walk. Spirits and creatures that normally stayed hidden might emerge. The wild hunt, which we'll talk more about later, rode across the winter sky. This was a time of both celebration and terror, of hope for the sun's return, and fear of what might happen before it came back. Among these pre-Christian beliefs were various nature spirits and deities associated with wilderness, fertility, and the untamed aspects of the natural world. Some scholars trace Krampus back to these older figures, suggesting he represents a survival of pre-Christian Alpine paganism, perhaps connected to nature spirits, or wild men of the woods that appear in various European folkloric traditions. The goat-like features might connect him to fauns or satyrs from classical mythology, which itself may have influenced Germanic folklore. Others suggest connections to Perchta, wild spirits we'll discuss shortly, or to representations of the devil himself as Christianity spread through the region. The truth is probably a blend. As Christianity moved into the Alps, starting in earnest in the early medieval period, missionaries and priests encountered existing winter traditions rather than completely suppressing them, which often proved impossible. The Church frequently adapted them. Local spirits and festivals were reframed within Christian contexts. Pagan gods became saints or demons. Old celebrations were attached to Christian holidays. St. Nicholas, a real historical figure from the 4th century Asia Minor who became legendary for his generosity and miracle working, was an ideal figure to Christianize winter gift-giving traditions. But the older, darker aspects of winter celebration didn't disappear. They became Nicholas's companion, reframed as a demon or devil figure, explicitly subordinate to the saint, but still very much present. This created something unique, a Christmas tradition that explicitly acknowledged darkness alongside light, fear alongside joy, punishment alongside reward, while other regions developed traditions where St. Nicholas, or later Santa Claus figures, simply ignored naughty children or gave them coal. The Alpine regions maintained this much more visceral, immediate, physical representation of consequences. The Krampus tradition evolved over centuries. By the medieval period, it was well established. By the early modern period, the 1500s through the 1700s, it had developed into elaborate community celebrations. Young men in villages would dress up as Krampus, creating or inheriting intricate costumes. These weren't simple Halloween costumes. Krampus suits were serious undertakings. The furs alone might represent months of work, treating animal pelts to remain supple and properly shaped. The masks were carved from wood by skilled craftspeople, each one unique, each one designed to terrify. The chains were real metal, heavy enough to create that authentic rattling sound. The cowbells, which became a standard part of the costume in many regions, were actual bells from cattle, massive and loud. On Krampusnacht, these young men would gather as night fell. Sometimes they'd start in one part of the village and process through the streets. Sometimes they'd appear suddenly, bursting from the darkness. They'd run through the streets, bells clanging, chains rattling, making aggressive gestures at bystanders, particularly at young women and children. Spectators would line the streets, half thrilled, half terrified. In some villages, it became a game. Young people would deliberately provoke the Krampus figures, getting as close as they dared before running away. But the Krampus runners took their roles seriously. They might chase, grab, or playfully threaten people, staying in character completely. This is where that release valve element comes in. Remember, these were young men, often teenagers, and men in their 20s, living in extremely restrictive small communities. Social rules were rigid. Behavior was constantly monitored. The church controlled much of public and private life. But on Krampusnacht, while wearing the mask and costume, young men could be wild. They could be aggressive. They could be frightening. They could embody chaos and darkness and untamed nature. The mask, in anthropological terms, allowed them to become something other than their everyday selves. The community sanctioned this transformation for this one night. It wasn't rebellion against the social order. It was a structured release built into the social order, a way of acknowledging and channeling energies that existed but normally had no outlet. This is deeply ancient human behavior. Cultures around the world and throughout history have created similar traditions, masked festivals and inverted social norms, times when the powerless could mock the powerful, when wildness was temporarily permitted, when the rules that governed everyday life were suspended. The Roman Saturnalia did this. Medieval carnival traditions did this. Krampusnacht served this function in Alpine communities. Over time, these celebrations became more organized. By the 19th century, especially in Austria, Krampus runs became major community events with established routes and rules. Krampus societies formed, groups dedicated to maintaining the tradition, training new participants, and preserving the craft of costume making. When you joined a Krampus society, you learned from experienced runners how to move in costume, how to stay safe while running in heavy fur and a mask with limited visibility, how to interact with crowds, how to embody the character properly. But Krampus nearly disappeared. Twice. The first threat came from the Catholic Church itself. Particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, church authorities in Austria and Bavaria, concerned about the tradition's obvious pagan elements and its sometimes chaotic nature, attempted several times to ban or suppress Krampus celebrations. They saw the tradition as inappropriate, too dark, too rowdy, potentially dangerous, and uncomfortably pagan. Some local priests refused to allow Krampus to accompany St. Nicholas. Some bishops issued decrees against the celebrations. These efforts had varying success depending on the region, but the tradition proved remarkably resilient. Communities valued it too much to give it up entirely. The second, more serious threat came from the Nazi regime. When Germany annexed Austria in 1938, Nazi authorities explicitly banned Krampus. The reasons were complex. Partly, the Nazis wanted to reshape Christmas into a purely Germanic, non-Christian celebration, focusing on Yule and ancient Teutonic traditions, which made the Christian St. Nicholas unwelcome, and his companion by extension. Partly, they saw Krampus as representing unhealthy superstition and backwardness that didn't fit their vision of modern Germanic culture. The ban was enforced, and for several years, the tradition went underground or disappeared entirely in some areas. After World War II, Krampus came back. Communities that had maintained the tradition for centuries weren't about to let it die. Through the late 1940s and 1950s, Krampus runs resumed. The tradition rebuilt itself, though some villages had lost their accumulated knowledge and costumes and had to start over. By the 1960s and 70s, Krampus was firmly re-established in Austria and Bavaria, and it began to spread beyond its traditional Alpine heartland. Here's where the story gets interesting for modern audiences. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Krampus underwent a transformation in public consciousness. He went from an obscure regional tradition to an international phenomenon. This happened through several channels. First, Austrian and German immigrants, particularly those who'd settled in the United States in the 19th century, had brought memories of Krampus with them, though the tradition didn't transfer as strongly as it did for some other Christmas customs. Second, beginning in the 1990s, alternative culture in the United States, particularly in goth and horror fan communities, discovered Krampus through vintage European Christmas cards from the early 1900s. These cards, which often depicted Krampus in surprisingly cute or darkly humorous ways, became collectible items. Third, the internet age allowed information about Krampus to spread globally, and his image hit a sweet spot for people looking for alternatives to increasingly commercialized mainstream Christmas traditions. By the 2000s, Krampus had become enough of a phenomenon that Hollywood took notice, resulting in movies, television appearances, and mainstream media coverage. Krampus runs in Austria now attract international tourists. American cities have started their own Krampus events, though these often have a playful, theatrical quality, quite different from the traditional Alpine version. You can buy Krampus decorations, Krampus ugly Christmas sweaters, even Krampus tree ornaments. He's been simultaneously preserved as a living tradition in his homeland and transformed into a global pop culture figure. But Krampus isn't alone. He's actually just one member of a whole cast of dark winter figures from European folklore. Each region had its own variations, its own terrifying Christmas companions, and each tells us something different about how people understood winter, darkness, and the price of stepping outside community norms. Let's head north and east from the Alps into the Germanic regions of southern Germany, Austria, and beyond. Here we meet another figure, one whose name means different things in different dialects, but whose role is consistent: Frau Perchta, or Perchta, the beautiful one, though you might not think her beautiful if you met her on a dark winter's night. Perchta is older than Krampus, or at least the folklore surrounding her seems to reach back further into pre-Christian Germanic paganism. She's not a simple monster or demon. She's complex, powerful, and in many ways more frightening than Krampus, because she doesn't need St. Nicholas. She operates independently, following her own ancient rules. In the earliest references, which appear in medieval German texts, Perchta seems to be a goddess or powerful spirit associated with the 12 days of Christmas, that period between December 25th and January 6th. Her particular concern was with spinning and weaving, traditionally women's work in pre-industrial Europe. During the 12 days, women were supposed to complete all their spinning from the past year. Unfinished work was forbidden. This wasn't just a suggestion. It was a taboo, a serious prohibition backed by supernatural threat. Perchta would walk abroad during the 12 days, particularly on 12th night, inspecting homes. If she found that the household's spinning had been completed, that the women had fulfilled their duties, that the home was clean and the proper foods had been eaten, she would leave blessings. The household would prosper in the coming year. But if she found laziness, if spinning remained unfinished, if the home was dirty or the proper observances hadn't been maintained, Perchta would punish the offenders, and her punishments were severe, at least in the tales told to reinforce the taboos. What's fascinating about Perchta is her dual nature. Some descriptions present her as beautiful, a shining figure in white, benevolent and blessing. Other descriptions make her terrifying. An old woman with a long nose, or a figure with one large foot, sometimes called a swan foot or goose foot. Her appearance could change depending on her mood or the observer's behavior. She led a host of followers, spirits or souls, particularly including the souls of unbaptized children. According to later Christianized versions of the legends, the cult of Perchta, if we can call it that, seems to have been particularly strong in what's now southern Germany and Austria. During the medieval period, church authorities wrote about her with concern, trying to discourage belief in her, but the traditions persisted. She wasn't easy to Christianize. Unlike Krampus, who could be reframed as a demon subordinate to St. Nicholas, Perchta was too powerful, too independent. Some regions tried to merge her with St. Lucia, whose feast day falls in December, but Perchta's older, darker attributes, never quite fit Christian frameworks. Over time, particularly from the 16th century onward, Perchta became associated with groups of wild spirits called the Perchten. These were supernatural beings, neither entirely good nor entirely evil, who roamed during the winter months. They were divided into two types: the Schönperchten, beautiful Perchten, and the Skeakperchten, ugly Perchten. The beautiful ones brought blessings, fertility, and good fortune. The ugly ones drove away evil spirits and the remnants of winter, but they were frightening to encounter, with monstrous masks and aggressive behavior. This led to the development of Perchtenlaufen, Perchten runs, similar in some ways to Krampus runs, but with their own distinct character. These traditions developed most strongly in Salzburg and Tyrol regions. Groups of young men would create elaborate costumes representing either the beautiful or ugly Perchten. The costumes for Schönperchten might include large, elaborate headdresses, carved and decorated, along with more refined masks. The costumes for Skeakperchten featured wild furs, grotesque wooden masks with horns or tusks, or bizarre features, and cowbells. These groups would perform on specific nights during the winter season, particularly around Twelfth Night, processing through villages, dancing, making noise, and creating a spectacle that was both entertainment and ritual. The Perchten traditions served similar social functions to Krampus runs, that sanctioned wildness, that release valve, that acknowledgement of darkness and chaos within a controlled framework. But they also did something else. They marked the turning of the year. The 12 days of Christmas were liminal time. Neither fully the old year nor fully the new normal rules were suspended. The dead could walk. Spirits were abroad. The Perchten embodied this liminality, this betwixt and between state. Their runs helped close out the old year and drive its lingering darkness away, clearing space for the new year to begin properly. Like Krampus, the Perchten traditions faced suppression from both church authorities. Like Krampus, they survived and have been revived. Modern Perchten runs in Austria and Bavaria attract thousands of spectators. The craft of mask making has been preserved and elevated to an art form, with master carvers creating pieces of stunning intricacy and power. UNESCO has recognized some of these traditions as intangible cultural heritage worth preserving. But let's move to different regions now, because across the German-speaking world and beyond, St. Nicholas, or Father Christmas, or various other gift-bringing figures, almost always had a companion, and these companions were rarely kind. In many parts of Germany, particularly in the north and central regions, St. Nicholas was accompanied by a figure called Knecht Ruprecht, whose name roughly translates to farmhand Rupert or servant Rupert. He appears in written records as early as the 17th century, though oral traditions likely predate this. Knecht Ruprecht wore dark clothes, often with a hood or mask, and carried a bag of ashes or switches. Unlike the bestial Krampus, Ruprecht was usually depicted as human, though rough and frightening, often with a blackened face from soot. His role was similar to Krampus, questioning children about their prayers and behavior, distributing switches or small punishments to those who'd misbehaved. While St. Nicholas gave gifts to the good, but Knecht Ruprecht had interesting variations. In some versions, he was a rescued soul, a former damned spirit whom St. Nicholas had saved and reformed, who now served the saint as penance. In others, he was more independent, perhaps a house spirit or minor demon, whom Nicholas had somehow bound into service. Some traditions made him almost sympathetic, a rough but ultimately good-hearted figure doing a necessary job. The name Ruprecht might connect to pre-Christian Germanic mythology, possibly to a figure associated with Odin or other Germanic gods, though this connection is debated among folklorists. What's clear is that Knecht Ruprecht served as a darker mirror to St. Nicholas, the threat that made the saint's rewards meaningful, the shadow side of Christmas gift-giving. In the Palatinate region and among Palatine German communities, a similar but distinct figure emerged, Belsnickel. The name might derive from a combination of Belze, meaning fur, and nickel. A diminutive of Nicholas Belsnickel wore ragged furs turned inside out, making him look wild and unkempt. His face might be covered with a mask or darkened with soot. He carried switches and sometimes candy or small gifts. But here's what made Belsnickel unique. He came alone, without St. Nicholas. He embodied both the rewarding and punishing aspects in one figure. Belsnickel would arrive sometime in the weeks before Christmas, knocking on doors late at night. When he entered a home, he would throw candy or nuts on the floor, and children would scramble to collect them. But while they grabbed for treats, Belsnickel would threaten them with his switch, smacking at them if they were too greedy or poorly behaved. It was a test. Could children control themselves, take only their share, behave respectfully even in excitement? The candy was both gift and temptation Belsnickel watched and judged. This tradition traveled to America with German immigrants, particularly the Palatine Germans who settled in Pennsylvania in the 18th and 19th centuries in Pennsylvania. Dutch country, Belsnickel became one of the few dark Christmas figures to really take root in American soil. The tradition continued in some communities well into the 20th century and has been revived in recent decades as part of Pennsylvania Dutch cultural heritage. The Pennsylvania German version of Belsnickel softened somewhat over generations, becoming more comical than frightening, but the basic structure remained, a ragged, furry figure appearing before Christmas, testing children, offering both reward and threat. In the 21st century, Belsnickel has gained wider recognition, appearing in American television shows and books about Christmas traditions, though often in simplified or comedic forms. These dark companions, whether Krampus, Knecht Ruprecht, Belsnickel, or the various regional names for similar figures, all served a common purpose. They made Christmas more than just receiving. They introduced consequences, judgment, the need to be worthy of gifts. In modern psychologically informed terms, we might say they externalized children's consciences, gave physical form to guilt and the fear of punishment, and provided a mechanism for parents to enforce behavior without having to be the constant bad guy themselves. St. Nicholas loved you and wanted to give you gifts. But if you'd been bad, well, that was between you and his companion. Parents could remain good parents, while the dark companion took the blame for disappointed expectations. But there's something else happening in all these traditions, something deeper and older. These figures emerge during the darkest part of the year, the weeks around the winter solstice, when night dominates day, when the sun seems weakest, when death seems closest. They're manifestations of winter itself, of its dangers and its power, of the very real threats that the season brought to pre-modern people. They're also manifestations of wildness, of everything outside civilization's boundaries. The forest, the mountain, the night, the beast, the stranger, everything that civilization is built to protect against. By giving form to these fears, by ritualizing them, by making them part of a controlled celebration, rather than a formless dread, these traditions help people manage very real anxieties. Children learn that yes, there are things to fear, but those things can be dealt with. Adults reinforce community norms, while also acknowledging the pressures those norms created. Everyone participated in a shared cultural experience that said, we know it's dark, we know it's dangerous, we know we're all a little afraid, and that's okay. We'll face it together, with ritual, with humour, with controlled chaos, and we'll come through to the other side. Now we need to talk about something that appears again and again in Germanic winter folklore, something that connects many of these traditions and reaches back into the deepest layers of pre-Christian belief. We need to talk about the wild hunt. Imagine standing outside on a winter night. The air is so cold it burns your lungs. The moon is bright enough to cast shadows on the snow. Everything is silent in that particular way winter has, where sound itself seems frozen, and then you hear it. Distant at first, so faint you're not sure you heard anything at all. The baying of hounds, the sound of horns, the thunder of hooves, except not quite like regular hooves, something stranger, deeper, resonating in your chest. The sound grows closer, louder, and suddenly you realize it's coming from above, from the sky itself. You look up and you see them. Figures on horseback racing through the air, spectral hounds running ahead of them, the whole procession glowing with a pale, cold light. They're hunting something, pursuing it across the winter sky, and you realize with horror that if they see you, if you're caught out when they pass, you might be swept up with them, carried away on their eternal ride. This is the wild hunt, one of the most persistent and widespread elements of Germanic and Celtic folklore. It appears in various forms across Northern Europe, from Scandinavia through Germany and France to the British Isles, with local variations but consistent core elements. A group of supernatural hunters, often led by a powerful figure, ride through the sky, particularly during winter, especially during the 12 days of Christmas and around the winter solstice. Encountering the hunt is dangerous. At best, it's a terrible omen. At worst, the hunt might take you with them, or drive you mad, or hunt you. In Germanic regions, the wild hunt was often associated with Odin, the king of the Norse gods. Odin, called Wotan in Old High German, was among other things a god of war, death and magic. He led the Inherjar, the noble dead, who feasted in Valhalla. During winter, particularly during Yule, the old Germanic midwinter celebration, Odin was said to ride out with the dead, hunting across the sky. This was both terrifying and holy. To see the hunt might mean your own death was approaching, as Odin gathered souls. But it also represented the power of the gods, the continuing presence of the divine in the world. When Christianity spread through Germanic territories, the wild hunt didn't disappear. It couldn't be easily Christianized, though some attempts were made, recasting the hunt's leader as various saints, or even as the devil. But the tradition was too old, too deeply rooted. Instead, it persisted in folk belief. People continued to report hearing or seeing the hunt. During winter, stories continued to be told. Warnings continued to be passed down. Stay inside on certain nights. Don't look up if you hear strange sounds in the sky. Lay face down on the ground if the hunt passes over you. Leave offerings at crossroads. The hunt became connected to Christmas almost by default, because Christmas absorbed Yule, and Yule was when the hunt rode. The 12 days of Christmas, that liminal period between the old year and the new, became a particularly dangerous time, when the hunt was most active, when the boundary between worlds was thinnest, when the dead walked and spirits roamed freely. Different regions had different names for the hunt. In Germany, it might be called the Wilde Jagd, the wild hunt. In parts of France, the Chasse-galerie. In England, variations included the wild hunt, Hearn's hunt, or the devil's dandy dogs in Cornwall. Wales had the Tidwyn Annandwyn, the Hounds of Annamyn. The otherworld Scandinavia had Oscarai or Osgårdsraya, the Asgard Ride. The leader's identity varied, sometimes Odin or Wotan, sometimes a local noble or king who had died and was condemned to hunt eternally, sometimes a wild woman or goddess figure, sometimes the devil himself in Christianized versions. What's remarkable is how persistent these stories were. We have accounts from as late as the 19th century, even into the early 20th, of rural people claiming to have heard or seen the wild hunt. The tradition had remarkable staying power, maintaining itself for centuries after official conversion to Christianity, surviving into the age of rationalism and scientific thinking. The wild hunt connects to Christmas traditions in several ways. First, it helped establish the 12 days as a dangerous, supernatural time. This in turn justified many of the protective rituals and celebrations. You gathered with family and community partly because it was safer, because there was protection in numbers, in lit fires, in shared faith. Second, many of the masked winter traditions we've discussed, the Krampus runs, the Perchta processions, can be seen as human imitations of the wild hunt groups of men, dressed as spirits or demons or wild creatures, racing through villages making noise and chaos, echoing the hunt's sky-born procession. This might have served as sympathetic magic, a way of controlling or channeling the hunt's power by imitating it. Third, the hunt reinforced the idea that winter, and particularly the Christmas season, was a time when normal rules didn't apply, when the supernatural was close, when danger and wonder both increased. There's scholarly debate about the origins of the wild hunt tradition. Some see it as genuinely ancient, reaching back to Indo-European roots. Others suggest it may have developed in the early medieval period as Christian and pagan beliefs mixed. Some argue it represents folk memory of actual historical events, perhaps raids or military processions, that were mythologized over time. The truth probably involves elements of all these theories. What matters for our purposes is that the wild hunt was real in the minds of people across Northern Europe for over 1,000 years, and it shaped how they understood winter and Christmas. The hunt also appears in high culture. Goethe referenced it. Wagner incorporated it into his operas. J.R.R. Tolkien, deeply read in Germanic folklore, echoed it in his description of the Nazgul and other dark riders in The Lord of the Rings. It remains a powerful image in modern fantasy and horror, this idea of a supernatural hunt that can appear from nowhere, that follows its own incomprehensible rules, that represents something wild and unchained that civilization can never fully tame. Let's shift geography now, north to Iceland, where Christmas traditions took their own unique, dark turn. Iceland's isolation, its harsh environment, and its unusual cultural history created Christmas folklore that in some ways out-horrors anything we've discussed so far. Because in Iceland, Christmas isn't threatened by one figure or even a small group. It's threatened by an entire family of monsters. First, we have Grýla. She's an ogress, a giantess, a troll woman, depending on which source you consult. She's very old, appearing in Icelandic texts as early as the 13th century. In the earliest references, she's not specifically associated with Christmas, but rather is a general child-frightening figure. But by the 17th century, Grýla had become firmly attached to Christmas, and her story had expanded considerably. Grýla lives in the mountains of Iceland with her lazy third husband, Lepaludi, and her 13 sons, the Yule Lads. She's enormous, monstrous, with multiple tails and hooves for hands in some descriptions, and she has a specific hunger. She eats naughty children. During Advent and the Christmas season, Grýla comes down from her mountain cave, sniffing out misbehaving children. When she finds them, she captures them in her sack, carries them back to her cave, and cooks them in her enormous cauldron, making stew. The tales were quite explicit about this in traditional tellings, which definitely gave Icelandic children motivation to behave. But Grýla doesn't come alone. She has those 13 sons, the Jólasveinar, the Yule Lads. These aren't the jolly gift-givers they've become in modern Icelandic Christmas celebrations. Traditionally, they were trolls, pranksters at best, and genuinely threatening at worst. Each had his own name describing his particular form of mischief or theft. Stekkjastor, sheepcoat clod, who harassed sheep. Giljagor, gullygork, who hid in gullies waiting to steal milk from cowsheds. Stufur, stubby, who was unusually short and stole pans to eat the crusts left in them. Þvöruslíkir, spoon licker, who stole wooden spoons to lick. Potaskafil, pot scraper, who stole leftovers from pots. Askaslíkir, bowl licker, who hid under beds waiting for someone to put down their bowl so he could steal it. Hurðaskellir, door slammer, who kept people awake by slamming doors. Skægammur, skægagobbler, who loved Icelandic yogurt. Bjúnakreikja, sausage swiper, who hid in the rafters to steal sausages. Gluggagakja, window peeper, who looked through windows to find things to steal. Gatatheffer, doorway sniffer, who had an enormous nose and used it to find leaf-bred kettkroker. Meat hook, who used hooks to steal meat. And finally, Katasnika, candle stealer, who followed children to steal their candles, which were made of tallow and thus edible. In the old traditions, these Yule Lads would come down from the mountains one by one, starting 13 days before Christmas. One each night they'd cause their particular brand of mischief, stay for a while, then head back to the mountains. The last one would leave 13 days after Christmas, ending the Yule season. Their visits weren't friendly. They were invasions, disruptions, thefts. They represented the chaos and danger of winter, the way the dark season could literally come into your home and take what little you had. But wait, there's more. The family has a pet, the Jólakötturinn, the Yule cat. And this isn't a cute Christmas kitten. The Yule cat is enormous, monstrous, with glowing eyes that can see through the darkness, and the Yule cat eats people who don't receive new clothes for Christmas. Yes, new clothes. The tradition developed as a way to encourage productivity during the autumn months before Christmas. Workers who'd been industrious in the wool processing season would receive new clothes as a reward. Those who'd been lazy would not, and those without new clothes would be, according to the legend, devoured by the Yule cat when it prowled on Christmas Eve. This created an interesting social pressure system. Employers needed to provide at least some new article of clothing to their workers. Workers needed to be productive. Children needed to help with household tasks to earn their new clothes. And everyone needed to look out for those too poor to afford new clothes, because Christian charity demanded helping them avoid the Yule cat's hunger. The monster reinforced both work ethic and community support for the vulnerable. Now, you might be wondering how Icelandic children dealt with this absolutely terrifying Christmas folklore. The answer is that these stories served similar purposes to the Alpine traditions we discussed earlier. They reinforce crucial winter survival behaviors. Don't waste food. Look at all those Yule Lads stealing it. Keep the house secure. Work hard during harvest and preparation seasons, because winter is coming and it's hungry. Help others because we're all vulnerable. But here's what's fascinating about the Icelandic traditions. They've transformed more dramatically in modern times than perhaps any other European Christmas folklore. The Yule Lads have become beloved figures in modern Iceland, almost completely stripped of their threatening nature. They now leave small gifts in shoes that children place on windowsills during the 13 nights before Christmas. They've been given cute, friendly appearances in children's books and decorations. Grýla still lurks in the stories, but more as a distant threat than an immediate one. Even the Yule cat has been somewhat softened, though Icelandic children still get new clothes for Christmas, just in case. This transformation happened relatively recently, mostly in the mid to late 20th century, as Iceland modernized and urbanized. The old stories were seen as too frightening, too harsh for modern sensibilities. Publishers and educators deliberately reworked the folklore into more child-friendly versions. It's a clear example of how folklore adapts to changing cultural needs. The core elements remained: the 13 visitors, the mountain home, the Christmas timing, but the emotional tone shifted from fear to fondness. Yet older Icelanders remember the scarier versions, and there's been some recent interest in preserving those traditional tales alongside the modern sanitized ones. Folk museums in Iceland display information about the original traditions. Some writers and artists have created works that return to the darker roots. It's a negotiation between honoring heritage and protecting children, between preserving authentic folklore and adapting to contemporary values. Iceland's Christmas monsters also reveal something important about how isolated communities developed their own unique traditions. Iceland was settled relatively late, in the 9th and 10th centuries, primarily by Norse people from Scandinavia. It remained extremely isolated for much of its history, with a little outside cultural influence compared to mainland European regions. This allowed Icelandic folklore to develop in its own direction, preserving some elements that might have been lost elsewhere, while also creating entirely unique features. The Yule Lads don't have clear parallels in other Scandinavian Christmas traditions. They're distinctly Icelandic, shaped by Iceland's specific environment, its social structure, its particular blend of Norse paganism and Christianity. The volcanic landscape of Iceland, with its geysers and lava fields, its dark winters and bright summers, its sense of being on the edge of the world, all of this fed into folklore that emphasized the strange, the monstrous, the otherworldly. Trolls and hidden people and ghosts weren't abstract concepts. They felt real in a landscape that itself seemed unreal, dangerous, and beautiful in equal measure. Now we need to step back and look at the bigger picture. Why did all of these traditions develop across Northern Europe? Why was Christmas, of all holidays, associated with such darkness and fear? To understand this, we need to understand what Christmas replaced and absorbed. Christmas, the celebration of Jesus Christ's birth, was established as a major Christian feast by the 4th century. But the date of December 25th was chosen, not because anyone knew when Jesus was actually born. Scholars generally agree his birth likely occurred at a different time of year, but because December 25th was already an important date in the Roman calendar. It was Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquered sun, a festival celebrating the sun god. It fell shortly after the winter solstice, that astronomical moment when the sun reaches its lowest point and begins returning, when days begin, imperceptibly at first, to grow longer again. When Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire and spread throughout Europe, it encountered existing winter solstice celebrations everywhere it went. These weren't uniform. Different cultures had different traditions, but they shared common themes. The solstice was a turning point, the darkest moment, but also the promise of light's return. It was a time of both celebration and danger, a time when normal rules were suspended, when the dead walked, when spirits were active. In Germanic and Celtic regions, midwinter celebrations were called various names. Yule was common in Germanic areas. These celebrations involve feasting, certainly, making use of animals that couldn't be kept through winter for lack of fodder. They involve fire, lots of fire, as both practical heating and symbolic encouragement for the sun's return. They involved evergreen decorations, plants that stayed alive through winter, serving as symbols of continuing life. They involved divination and prophecy, attempts to see what the coming year would bring. They involved honoring the dead and various deities, and they involved acknowledging the very real dangers of winter. Pre-Christian people in Northern Europe knew winter could kill. Not metaphorically, literally. Starvation was a real possibility if harvests had been poor or stores were depleted. Freezing to death was a genuine risk. Diseases spread more easily in crowded winter living conditions. Travel was dangerous. Accidents were more common in darkness and ice. Childbirth in winter had lower survival rates. The season itself was a threat, so winter celebrations weren't purely joyful. They couldn't be. They had to acknowledge fear while also asserting hope. The darkness is strong, but light will return. Death is close, but life persists. The spirits walk, but we have protections. This created traditions that mixed feasting and fear, celebration and solemnity, gifts and threats. When Christianity arrived, it couldn't simply erase these deeply embedded cultural responses to winter. Instead, Christmas absorbed them. The feast moved to December 25th gift-giving, which had been part of Roman Saturnalia and other winter festivals, became part of Christmas. Evergreen decorations were reinterpreted as symbols of eternal life through Christ Yule logs became Christmas logs. Feast days of various saints were positioned around the solstice period, creating the 12 days of Christmas. But the darker elements persisted too, though they were reframed. Spirits and demons that had walked during Yule now walked during Christmas, but they became explicitly Christian demons, or were pressed into service as companions to Christian saints. The wild hunt, which had been Odin's ride, became either the devil's hunt, or was vaguely Christianized as the hunt of various saints, or historical figures, house spirits, and nature deities became either demons to be feared, or helpful spirits to be honored, depending on how they fit into local Christian practice. This syncretism, this blending of Christian and pre-Christian elements, created the Christmas we recognize today. Nearly every traditional Christmas element has roots in pre-Christian practice. The Christmas tree comes from Germanic traditions of decorating evergreens during Yule. Mistletoe was sacred to the Druids, and used in Norse mythology, holly and ivy were used in Roman Saturnalia. Caroling developed from wassailing traditions that were pre-Christian. Even Santa Claus himself, while based on the historical Saint Nicholas, absorbed elements from Odin, who rode through the sky during Yule, and from various gift-bringing spirits and deities. The dark figures we've been discussing, Krampus, Perchta, the Yule Lads, all these represent the part of winter celebration that couldn't be sanitized or easily Christianized. They're the leftover paganism, the acknowledgement that winter is dangerous, that darkness is real, that there are things to fear, not just things to celebrate. The Catholic Church had a complicated relationship with these traditions. On one hand, church authorities frequently tried to suppress them as pagan remnants or improper superstitions. On the other hand, the traditions served useful purposes. They reinforced moral behavior. They brought communities together. They made Christianity more accessible by linking it to familiar cultural practices. So the Church's response varied by region and time period, from harsh suppression to grudging tolerance to active incorporation. By the medieval period, Christmas had become a fascinating hybrid. The religious elements, the celebration of Christ's birth, the nativity story, the church services, were genuinely Christian, but surrounding these were layers of folk tradition that had roots going back centuries before Christianity arrived. People attended midnight mass, then came home to leave offerings for house spirits. They celebrated saints' feast days while also performing rituals to protect against the wild hunt. They taught their children Christian prayers and also warned them about Perchta or Krampus. This dual nature of Christmas continued through the early modern period. The Protestant Reformation complicated things further. Protestant reformers, particularly Calvinists, were often hostile to Christmas celebrations altogether, seeing them as too Catholic and too pagan. In some Protestant regions, Christmas was banned or severely restricted for periods during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. This included Puritan New England, where Christmas celebrations were actually illegal for a time. But folk traditions proved resilient. Even in regions where official Christmas observance was restricted, winter celebrations continued in modified forms. People found ways to maintain traditions, sometimes by detaching them from explicit Christmas associations, sometimes by practicing them privately, sometimes by framing them as secular seasonal customs rather than religious ones. The 19th century brought major changes to Christmas across the Western world. This is when Christmas, as we know it today, really took shape. Several factors converged. First, the Industrial Revolution created urban middle classes with disposable income and a desire for domestic, family-centered celebrations. Second, romantic nationalism across Europe led to increased interest in folk traditions and cultural heritage. Scholars and writers began collecting and publishing folklore, including Christmas traditions, some of which had been declining. Third, new technologies, particularly printing, allowed Christmas imagery and stories to spread widely through cards, magazines, and books. Fourth, commercial interests recognized the profit potential in Christmas, leading to the development of Christmas shopping, Christmas advertising, and standardized Christmas products. This 19th century Christmas revolution had complex effects on the dark traditions we've been discussing. In some ways, it threatened them. The emphasis shifted toward family warmth, childhood innocence, and commercial gift-giving. The darker, more frightening elements seemed out of place in this new, sentimentalized Christmas. In many regions, particularly in England and America, the dark figures faded from practice, surviving only in old stories or obsolete customs. But in other regions, particularly the Alpine areas and Germanic Europe, the dark traditions held on. They were too deeply embedded in local culture, too important to community identity, and something interesting happened. As these traditions became less universal, less taken for granted, they became more consciously preserved. People began to see them not just as the way Christmas was done, but as their cultural heritage, something worth protecting and maintaining. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw the creation of formal organizations dedicated to preserving these traditions. Krampus societies were established. Puritan groups formalized their structures. Rules were written down. Costumes that had been casually made were now crafted with serious attention to tradition. What had been living, evolving folk practice became, at least partly, conscious heritage preservation. This coincided with the development of folklore as an academic discipline. scholars began seriously studying these traditions, documenting them, analyzing their origins and meanings. Collections of folk tales were published. Regional variations were catalogued. The Brothers Grimm, though they worked earlier in the 19th century, exemplified this trend with their collections of German folklore. Their work influenced how people understood folklore. Sometimes in problematic ways, they tended to romanticize and Germanize the tales they collected, but they also helped preserve traditions that might otherwise have been lost. The 20th century brought new threats. 2 world wars disrupted or destroyed many traditional practices. The Nazi period, as mentioned earlier, explicitly banned some traditions while trying to co-opt others for nationalist purposes. Post-war modernization, increased mobility, urbanization, and the spread of mass media all threatened regional traditions. Television brought standardized, often American-influenced Christmas imagery into European homes, potentially displacing local customs. Yet somehow the dark Christmas figures survived. Some adapted. Krampus appeared on postcards in the early 1900s, often in surprisingly cute or humorous forms, which helped keep him in public consciousness. Even as the actual Krampus runs declined in some areas, the Yule Lads were transformed into gift givers. The traditions found new contexts and new meanings. And then something unexpected happened. Beginning in the late 20th century, particularly from the 1980s onward, there was a revival of interest in these traditions. Several factors drove this. First, there was a general countercultural movement against perceived excessive commercialization of Christmas people, looking for more authentic or meaningful ways to celebrate, became interested in older traditions. Second, there was growing appreciation for cultural diversity and local heritage. The same forces that led to UNESCO heritage designations and cultural preservation efforts made people value regional traditions more highly. Third, alternative communities, particularly goth and horror fan communities, discovered these dark Christmas figures and embraced them as delightfully contrary to mainstream Christmas sentimentality. Fourth, the internet allowed people to share information about obscure traditions, building interest and community across distances. Krampus in particular benefited from this revival. From being an obscure Alpine tradition known mainly to locals and folklorists, he became an international phenomenon. Krampus runs in Austria now attract tourists from around the world. American cities host Krampus events, though these often have a Halloween-like costume party atmosphere, quite different from the traditional Alpine versions. You can buy Krampus merchandise of every description. He's appeared in movies, television shows, comic books, and video games. There are academic conferences about him. He has his own Wikipedia page in dozens of languages. This modern Krampus is simultaneously traditional and new. In Austria and Bavaria, traditional Krampus runs continue with deep cultural roots, maintained by communities who've practiced them for generations. But elsewhere, Krampus has been adapted, reinterpreted, sometimes completely reimagined. He's become a symbol of resistance to Christmas commercialization, a mascot for people who like their holidays a bit darker, a Halloween figure displaced to December, a vehicle for creative costume making and performance art, an ironic comment on modern Christmas culture. Is this good or bad for the tradition? That's a complex question without a simple answer. On one hand, international interest has helped ensure that traditional Krampus runs in their homeland receive resources and recognition. Tourism brings money to regions that might otherwise struggle economically. Young people who might have drifted away from the tradition find it validated and cool because of international attention. On the other hand, there's always a risk when living traditions become tourist attractions or global phenomena. they can become self-conscious, performative, detached from their original meanings and contexts. There's concern about cultural appropriation, about outsiders taking elements of a tradition without understanding or respecting its cultural roots. The same tensions exist for other dark Christmas traditions. Perchta runs now have to negotiate between maintaining authentic traditional practice and providing entertaining spectacles for tourists. The Yule Lads are simultaneously traditional Icelandic figures and internationally recognized cute characters who appear on merchandise. These traditions are living things, and living things change. The question is how they change, how quickly, and who gets to decide what counts as authentic or acceptable. There's also the question of what happens to these traditions in an increasingly secular society. Many of them have Christian elements. They exist in dialogue with Christmas as a Christian holiday. As Europe becomes less religious, as church attendance declines, as Christmas becomes more secular and commercial, what happens to traditions that were meaningful partly because of their religious context? Can Krampus exist without St. Nicholas? Does Frau Perchta make sense outside a framework that includes concepts of sin and penance and seasonal religious observance? Some argue that these figures are flexible enough to adapt, that they've already adapted many times throughout their history, that they can maintain relevance by shedding religious elements and becoming purely cultural or entertainment traditions. Others argue that something essential is lost when traditions are severed from their original context, that Krampus, as a cute cosplay character or movie monster, isn't really Krampus in any meaningful sense. What's undeniable is that these traditions tell us something important about the human relationship with winter and darkness. We spent most of human history afraid of winter, and rightly so. Winter could and did kill people. Winter was long nights when danger was unseen, when resources ran low, when disease spread easily, when isolation was profound. Winter was when the old and the young and the sick were most vulnerable. Winter was starvation, freezing, darkness, death. Modern industrial society, particularly in wealthy nations, has largely conquered winter. We have central heating, electric lights, refrigeration that keeps food year-round, medical care that doesn't decline seasonally, transportation that mostly continues regardless of weather, and global supply chains that ensure we can eat fresh fruit in January. For most of us in the developed world, winter is an inconvenience or an aesthetic choice, not an existential threat. But something in us remembers, something in our collective cultural unconscious knows that winter is dangerous. And these traditions, these dark figures that emerge when nights are longest, they give form to that ancient knowledge. They remind us, however playfully or ironically or commercially, that winter means something, that darkness is real, that comfort and safety are achievements, not givens, that light matters because darkness exists, that gifts are precious because scarcity is possible. In a world where we've lost many traditional forms of meaning-making, where religious observance has declined, where community bonds are often weaker, where we're disconnected from natural cycles and seasonal realities, maybe we need these traditions more than ever. Not because we literally believe in Krampus or fear the wild hunt, but because they connect us to deeper truths about the human experience. They tell us that celebration requires acknowledging what we're celebrating against, that joy means more when we recognize what threatens it, that light is brightest in darkness, that winter passes, but only by going through it, not around it. The dark Christmas traditions also give us something that modern sanitized Christmas often lacks: complexity. Real life isn't all sweetness and light. Children aren't all innocent angels. Adults aren't all generous gift givers. Families aren't all harmonious. The world contains genuine darkness, genuine threats, genuine reasons for fear. A Christmas that acknowledges only joy and gives and comfort can feel hollow because it doesn't match reality. But a Christmas that includes Krampus alongside St. Nicholas, that makes room for fear alongside hope, that acknowledges winter's bite even while celebrating winter's beauty, that Christmas feels more complete, more honest, more real. This might be why these traditions are experiencing revival. In an age of compulsory holiday cheer, when we're pressured to be constantly joyful from November through January, when Christmas has become a marathon of shopping and parties and forced merriment, the dark figures offer permission to acknowledge that Christmas is also hard. It's expensive, it's stressful, it brings up family conflicts and painful memories and awareness of loss and loneliness. For many people, the sunny, cheerful Christmas narrative can make those who struggle during the holidays feel even worse, like they're failing at a time when everyone else is supposedly happy. But if Christmas includes Krampus, if it makes room for the difficult and the dark, then maybe there's space for everyone. Maybe you can struggle through December without feeling like you're ruining Christmas. Maybe you can acknowledge that this season brings up complicated feelings without betraying the holiday spirit. Maybe Christmas can be both joy and sorrow, both celebration and survival, both light and darkness, both the gift and the threat. The psychological term for this is integration. Healthy individuals integrate their shadow side, acknowledging and accepting their darker impulses and feelings, rather than denying them. Healthy cultures might do the same thing. A holiday tradition that includes both St. Nicholas and Krampus, both the gift giver and the punisher, both the light and the shadow, might be more psychologically complete than one that insists everything is merry and bright. Carl Jung, the psychologist who developed much of modern depth psychology, would likely have appreciated these traditions. He wrote extensively about the shadow, about how traits and impulses we deny or repress don't disappear, but instead express themselves in unhealthy ways. By giving the shadow a place, by personifying it as Krampus or Perchta or the Wild Hunt, these traditions might have allowed communities to acknowledge and channel darker impulses, rather than pretending they didn't exist. There's also something valuable in traditions that give children a more complex view of the world. Modern child rearing, at least in many Western cultures, often tries to shield children from anything frightening or upsetting. We want their childhoods to be purely happy, purely safe, purely innocent. But this isn't how life works. Children will encounter fear, disappointment, unfairness, consequences for their actions. Perhaps traditions that introduce these realities in controlled, ritualized ways, through figures like Krampus, who are frightening but not truly dangerous, who threaten but don't actually harm, actually help children develop emotional resilience and moral complexity. Folklore scholar Marina Warner has written about the importance of fairy tales, including their frightening elements, in child development. She argues that these stories help children work through fears and understand consequences in safe, symbolic ways. The same might be true for dark Christmas traditions. A child who encounters Krampus in ritual form, who experiences fear but comes through it safely, who learns that behaving well brings rewards, while misbehavior brings consequences, might be learning valuable lessons in a memorable, emotionally engaging way. Of course, this has to be calibrated to the child and the context. Traditions that worked in small Alpine villages with different cultural norms might not translate directly to modern urban settings. Some children are more sensitive to fear than others. Parents and communities need to use judgment about what's appropriate. but completely sanitizing childhood, removing all fear and all edge from celebrations, might not be doing children any favors. The dark Christmas traditions also remind us of the importance of community in facing difficulty. These weren't solitary traditions. They were communal. Everyone in the village participated in Krampus runs, either as performers or spectators. Everyone knew the stories of Perchta and taught them to their children. Everyone watched for the wild hunt together. These shared experiences created bonds. They gave people a common language for discussing fear and darkness. They created memories that linked generations. In our modern, atomized society, where many people live far from extended family, where communities are often loose and temporary, where we might not know our neighbors, there's something to learn from traditions that required and created community. The revival of interest in Krampus and similar figures often includes a communal element. People gather for Krampus runs or Krampus parties. They share information online, creating virtual communities around these traditions. They work together to make costumes or organize events. The traditions create connection. There's also something valuable in traditions that are specific to time and place. Everything about modern life tends toward homogenization. We wear the same brands, eat at the same chain restaurants, watch the same streaming services, celebrate holidays in increasingly similar ways, regardless of where we live. Regional traditions, local variations, specific cultural practices are under constant pressure. The dark Christmas figures, with their deep connections to specific regions and specific histories, represent resistance to this homogenization. They say, "This is how we do it here. This is our tradition, shaped by our history and our landscape and our culture. Not everything has to be universal or bland or commercial. The future of these traditions is uncertain. Will they continue to be practiced in their homelands by communities who've maintained them for generations? Certainly. Though they'll undoubtedly continue to evolve, will they spread to new areas, adapted and reinterpreted by people far from their origins? This is already happening. Will they become primarily commercial or entertainment phenomena, divorced from their original context? There's a risk of this. Will they fade as older generations die, and younger generations, shaped by global culture and digital media, lose interest? Possibly, though current trends suggest renewed rather than declining interest. What seems most likely is that these traditions will continue to exist in multiple forms simultaneously. Traditional practice in their homelands, with deep cultural meaning and community involvement, tourist-oriented versions that provide income and international recognition, commercial exploitation through products and media, adapted celebrations in new locations by people drawn to their aesthetic or message academic study, by folklorists and cultural historians, creative reinterpretation by artists and writers. Each of these forms is valid in its own way, and each will influence the others. The key is maintaining some connection to what made these traditions meaningful in the first place. They weren't just random scary things. They arose from specific historical and cultural contexts. They served specific purposes. They expressed specific understandings of winter, darkness, morality, community, and the human relationship with the natural and supernatural worlds. As long as new forms of the traditions maintain some connection to these deeper meanings, they can remain vital. When they become pure surface, pure aesthetic or commercial exploitation with no depth, they risk becoming hollow. But humans are good at finding and creating meaning. Even commercialized or adapted traditions can take on new significance for the people who practice them. Someone who encounters Krampus first through a movie or a Christmas market might become genuinely interested, learn about the tradition's history, perhaps even travel to Austria to experience an authentic Krampus run. A family in California might start their own Krampus tradition that's quite different from anything in the Alps, but still meaningful to them, still connected to ideas about darkness and light, consequences and celebration. Folklore has always been fluid, always evolving. The Krampus of 2025 is different from the Krampus of 1925, who was different from the Krampus of 1825, who was probably different from whatever pre-Christian figure or figures he evolved from traditions that don't evolve die. The trick is evolving while maintaining some essential core, some connection to origin and meaning. As we come to the end of our journey through dark Christmas traditions, it's worth reflecting on what we've learned. We've seen that Christmas, this holiday, we associate with joy and gifts and family warmth, has another side, a darker side with deep roots in human history and human psychology. We've met Krampus, the horned demon who accompanies Saint Nicholas, punishing naughty children, while his master rewards good ones. We've encountered Frau Perchta, the powerful winter goddess who inspects homes during the 12 days of Christmas, blessing or punishing based on what she finds. We've learned about Knecht Ruprecht and Belsnickel, and the various dark companions who shadowed gift-giving figures across Germanic Europe. We've heard the baying of hounds in the winter sky and learned about the wild hunt, that terrifying procession of supernatural hunters that races through the longest nights. We've travelled to Iceland to meet Grýla the ogress and her 13 troublesome sons, the Yule Lads, and the enormous Yule cat, who prowls on Christmas Eve. We've explored how these traditions emerged from pre-Christian winter celebrations, how they were adapted and transformed by Christianity, how they served important social and psychological functions in their communities, and how they've been suppressed, revived, commercialized, and reinterpreted over centuries. We've considered why these traditions matter, what they tell us about the human relationship with winter and darkness, how they offer a more complex and perhaps more honest version of Christmas than the purely cheerful modern holiday. We've thought about their relevance in contemporary life, how they might speak to needs that sanitized, commercial Christmas doesn't address. What emerges from all this is a picture of Christmas as a holiday with genuine depth, with layers of meaning accumulated over thousands of years, a holiday that acknowledges both light and darkness, both joy and fear, both reward and consequence. A holiday rooted in the actual experience of winter, with its beauty and its danger, its hardship and its hope. A holiday that makes room for the full complexity of human experience. The dark figures of Christmas aren't villains. They're not trying to destroy Christmas or steal its joy. They're part of Christmas, essential elements that make the celebration complete. They're the shadows that make the light visible, the cold that makes warmth precious, the fear that makes safety meaningful, the consequences that make rewards valuable. Without them, Christmas is incomplete. With them, it's a holiday that can hold all of what it means to be human in winter, in darkness, in a world that contains both wonder and threat. So as December nights grow long and cold, as you hang your lights and wrap your gifts and gather with family, remember that Christmas has always been more than it seems, out there in the darkness, in the mountains and forests, in the old stories and older memories, Krampus and Perchta and the wild hunt and all their companions still wait, not to harm, not really, but to remind, to complete, to keep Christmas honest and whole and true. And with that, I'll leave you to drift off. If you enjoyed this journey through the darker side of Christmas, subscribe for more stories like this. For now though, just let yourself relax. Feel your body sinking deeper into whatever comfortable surface you're resting on. Your breath is slowing naturally. The weight of the day is lifting away. The stories we've explored tonight can drift through your thoughts like snowflakes, settling where they will, forming patterns you might remember or might forget. And either way is fine. You're safe. You're warm. The old traditions we discussed tonight, they were about creating that safety, marking the boundaries between shelter and wilderness, between community and isolation, between light and dark. You're on the safe side of those boundaries now. You can rest. The winter night outside is long and dark, and that's okay. That's how winter nights are supposed to be. Long and dark and cold, which makes this moment of warmth and rest and safety all the more precious. This quiet, this stillness. Good night. Sleep well. And may your dreams be neither too light nor too dark, but somewhere in between, where the best dreams live.